What happens when a moment meant for light-hearted television suddenly turns into something no one in the room is prepared for? What happens when charm meets resistance, when control meets challenge, and when one of the world's most composed stars is pushed just far enough to reveal something real? Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to Stage View, hit that like button, and drop a comment below. Because stories like this, they don't come around often, and you don't want to miss what unfolds next. The studio lights were already warm when the cameras began their slow, sweeping glide across the set. The audience, packed shoulder to shoulder, buzzed with anticipation. There's always energy in the room before a major guest walks out. But this time, it felt different. Charged. Electric. Like everyone sensed something unpredictable lingering just beneath the surface. Behind the scenes, producers moved with rehearsed urgency, their voices low but clipped through headsets. Timing cues. Segment reminders. Gentle warnings to keep it smooth. But live television has a way of ignoring even the best-laid plans. And then he stepped out. The applause hit instantly, loud, unified, almost reverent. He acknowledged it with that familiar, controlled smile. Confident. Measured. Every step calculated. Every gesture polished by decades in the spotlight. He waved, shook hands, took his seat like someone who had done this 1,000 times, because he had. Across from him, the panel sat ready. At first, everything moved exactly as expected. Pleasantries. Compliments. A few jokes to ease the tension. The kind of opening that lulls you into thinking the entire segment will glide by without a ripple. "So, it's great to have you here," one of the hosts began, smiling warmly. "You've had an incredible year." "Thank you," he replied, voice steady, almost rehearsed, but not inauthentic. Just controlled. "And people are saying this might be one of your most personal projects yet. Would you agree with that?" There was a pause. Brief. Almost invisible. But in a live setting, even a fraction of hesitation can stretch into something noticeable. "I think every project becomes personal in its own way," he said carefully. "You give a part of yourself to it." The audience nodded along. Comfortable. Engaged. But then something shifted. It didn't happen loudly. There was no dramatic music cue, no sudden outburst. Just a subtle change in tone, like a note slightly off-key in an otherwise perfect melody. Another host leaned forward slightly, her expression curious, but sharper now. "But some people feel like you don't always show that side publicly," she said. "That there's a distance. A wall." A ripple moved through the audience. Not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to be felt. He smiled again. But this time, it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well," he said, leaning back just slightly, "I think people see what they choose to see." It was a good answer. Safe. Controlled. The kind of response that keeps interviews moving forward without friction. But the air had already begun to tighten, and she didn't let it go. "Or maybe," she continued, tilting her head just a fraction, "they see what's presented to them." That was the moment. Not explosive. Not dramatic. But undeniable. You could feel it. The audience shifted in their seats. A few exchanged glances. Someone in the back let out a quiet, "Oh," before quickly covering their mouth. On stage, the energy changed completely. His posture stiffened, barely, but enough to register if you were paying attention. His hands, which had been relaxed, now clasped together. Still smiling. Still composed. But thinking. Carefully. Choosing his next words like they mattered more than usual. "I've always believed," he began slowly, "that the work should speak louder than anything else." And yet, she replied almost instantly, people connect with the person behind the work. The tension wasn't hidden anymore. It was there, out in the open, uncomfortable, real. The kind of moment that makes producers backstage start whispering faster. The kind that makes camera operators hold their shots a little longer, sensing something worth capturing. Another host jumped in, attempting to smooth things over. "Well, let's talk about the film, because it really is incredible." But it was too late. The thread had been pulled, and neither of them seemed willing to let it go. "No, it's okay," he said, turning slightly, his voice still calm but firmer now. "I think it's an interesting point." The audience went completely still. Even the usual background noises, the coughs, the shifting, the faint murmurs, seemed to disappear. He leaned forward just slightly. "People want authenticity," he continued. "But authenticity doesn't mean exposing every part of your life to the world." A pause. "And it doesn't mean meeting expectations that aren't yours to begin with." That landed. You could feel it. The host across from him didn't back down. but her expression changed. Not aggressive. Not confrontational. Focused. Fair, she said. But when you've built a career on being so visible, don't you think people feel entitled to understand you? There it was again. That edge. Not sharp enough to cut, but enough to press. He exhaled softly. For the first time, the smile faded completely. Entitled is an interesting word, he said. And suddenly the room felt smaller. The kind of small where every word echoes louder than it should. The kind where even the audience realizes they're not just watching an interview anymore. They're watching something unfold. Something real. And unpredictable. Behind the cameras, a producer gestured urgently. Wrap it, shift it, move on. But no one on stage acknowledged it. Because now it wasn't about timing. Or segments. Or ratings. It was about the moment. And both of them were in it. Fully. You've been in this industry a long time, she said, her voice softer now, but no less direct. You've seen how it changes people. How it shapes them. Do you ever worry that, in trying to stay in control, you might lose connection? The question hung in the air. Heavy. Personal. Dangerously close to a line most interviews never cross. For a split second, something flickered across his face. Not anger. Not frustration. Something else. Something harder to define. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. But stronger. I think connection doesn't come from giving people everything, he said. It comes from giving them something real. The audience leaned in. And what's real to me might not look the way people expect. Silence. Then a few scattered claps. Uncertain at first. Then growing. Not loud, but meaningful. Because everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed a shift. Not an explosion. Not a breakdown. But a crack. In the carefully constructed rhythm of a live show. And the moment wasn't over yet. Because she looked at him again, studying him now, not challenging, but not retreating either. And you could tell. This conversation? It was just getting started. The applause faded, but the tension didn't. It lingered in the air like something unfinished. Something waiting. For a brief second, the cameras cut to a wider shot, catching the entire table. Smiles returned on the surface. The kind of smiles that television trains you to wear when things drift too close to something real. But beneath that polished layer, there was a shift no one could ignore anymore. The audience felt it. The hosts felt it. And he definitely felt it. There's a rhythm to interviews like this. An unspoken agreement between guest and host. You ask, I answer. You push, I deflect. We dance around the edges, but we never step into the fire. That agreement had just been broken. And now no one quite knew how far this would go. One of the co-hosts leaned forward, trying to gently guide the moment back to safer ground. Her tone was lighter, her smile reassuring. I think what people admire is how consistent you've been over the years. That kind of discipline, it's rare. It was a lifeline, an opportunity to pivot. And for a moment, it looked like he might take it. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the comment. Consistency comes from focus, he said. You have to know what matters to you. Safe. Measured. Back on track. But then, a soft chuckle. Not from the audience. From across the table. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the calm like a whisper in a quiet room. She leaned back slightly, folding her arms, not defensively but thoughtfully. Her expression wasn't hostile. It was knowing. Focus is one thing, she said, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. But sometimes, focus can look a lot like avoidance. The words didn't explode. They settled. Heavy. Deliberate. The audience reacted immediately. Small gasps, a few murmurs, someone whispering, wow, under their breath. Because now it wasn't just tension. It was confrontation. Direct. Unfiltered. His eyes met hers. And for the first time since he walked out onto that stage, he didn't smile at all. There was no performance in that moment. Just presence. You think I'm avoiding something? He asked. His voice wasn't raised. But it carried. The kind of tone that fills a room without effort. She didn't hesitate. I think you're very good at choosing what you show, she replied. Another ripple through the audience. And I think sometimes, she continued, that choice keeps people at a distance. A beat. Silence stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable. This wasn't how these segments were supposed to go. Backstage, producers were already scrambling. One gestured toward the commercial cue. Another shook their head. No, not yet. Not while this is happening. Because this was the kind of television you couldn't script. At the table, one of the other hosts shifted in her seat, glancing between them, clearly debating whether to jump in again. But something stopped her. Maybe instinct. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the same thing everyone else in the room was feeling. You don't interrupt a moment like this. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. Calm. Controlled. But no longer distant. Let me ask you something, he said, his eyes locked on hers. Do you believe that everyone owes the world complete access to who they are? The question flipped the dynamic instantly. Now it wasn't just her asking. It was him. And the audience felt the shift. She smiled, but it wasn't a deflection. It was acknowledgement. Not complete access, she said. But honesty? Yeah, I think people deserve that. A pause. And I think you give honesty, she added. Just on your terms. There it was again. That edge. Not aggressive, but unyielding. He nodded slowly. As it should be, he replied. A few claps from the audience, supportive but cautious. She tilted her head. But what happens when your terms don't match what people need to connect with you? The question landed harder than the others. Because it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about perception. About image. About the invisible contract between celebrity and audience. For a moment, he didn't answer. And in that silence, something shifted again. Because now, it wasn't just tension. It was introspection. His gaze dropped briefly to the table. Then back up. And when he spoke, his voice was different. Still controlled. But quieter. More deliberate. I think, he said slowly, we live in a time where people confuse access with understanding. The audience leaned in. You can know everything about someone, he continued, and still not understand them at all. A murmur of agreement moved through the crowd. And sometimes, he added, the more you give, the less it actually means. That hit. You could feel it. Even she paused for a second, considering his words. But she wasn't done. Not yet. Or maybe, she said, her voice softer now, but just as steady. The more you hold back, the more people fill in the blanks themselves. That line, it changed everything. Because now the conversation wasn't just about boundaries. It was about consequences. The unintended narratives. The assumptions. The stories people create when they don't get answers. His jaw tightened slightly. Barely noticeable. But real. And whose responsibility is that? He asked. The room went still again. Is it mine, he continued, to correct every assumption? Or is it theirs to question what they think they know? The tension had reached a new level. Not loud, not explosive, but sharp, focused, unavoidable. The audience was completely silent now. No whispers, no movement, just attention. She leaned forward slightly, mirroring his posture. I think it's both, she said. But when you're in your position, the scale tips. A beat. You don't just influence stories, she added. You shape them. The weight of that statement hung in the air. Because it was true. And everyone knew it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched longer than anything before it. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. He smiled. But this time, it wasn't polished. It wasn't rehearsed. It was real. Small. Almost imperceptible. But real. You're not wrong, he said. The audience reacted instantly, soft laughter, a few surprised claps. Even the other hosts seemed to relax slightly, sensing a shift. But it wasn't a resolution. Not yet, because his expression changed again, subtle, but serious. But there's a difference, he continued, between shaping a story and being consumed by it. That line landed like a quiet echo. And suddenly, the conversation wasn't just tense. It was layered, complex, personal in a way that went far beyond the surface. She watched him closely now. Not challenging, not pushing, listening, really listening. And for the first time since this began, there was a pause that didn't feel like conflict. It felt like understanding. But just as quickly as it arrived, it shifted again. Because the conversation had gone too far to simply settle. And everyone in the room knew it. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because now, the question wasn't just about what he chooses to show. It was about why. And whether that why was something he was ready to face. On live television. In front of everyone. The cameras kept rolling. The audience held its breath. And across the table, she leaned in just slightly, as if preparing to ask the one question that might change everything. The silence didn't break all at once. It unraveled, slowly, almost painfully, like a thread being pulled from something tightly wound. You could feel it in the room. That strange, suspended moment where everyone knows something is about to happen, but no one knows exactly what it will be. The cameras stayed close now. No wide shots. No distractions. Just faces. Eyes. Reactions. Because this was no longer a casual interview. This was something else entirely. Across the table, she leaned in just slightly, her expression no longer probing for the sake of a headline, but searching for something real, something unguarded. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a different weight. Not sharper. Not louder. Just deeper. "Let me ask you something," she said quietly. The audience leaned forward almost as one. "What are you protecting?" That question didn't ripple. It landed. Hard. For the first time since he walked onto that stage, there was no immediate response. No smooth transition. No carefully measured reply. Just stillness. His eyes didn't move away from hers, but something behind them shifted. Not visibly enough for everyone to catch. But enough. Enough for the room to feel it. The kind of shift that doesn't come from discomfort alone. Something closer to recognition. The other hosts froze. One of them parted her lips slightly, as if to intervene, but stopped herself. Another glanced toward the producers, who were now completely still behind the cameras, hands hovering over controls they didn't dare touch. Because you don't cut away from something like this. You don't interrupt it. You let it unfold. Even if you don't know where it's going. He exhaled slowly. Not dramatically, but deliberately, as if buying himself a second, or maybe gathering something he hadn't expected to need. "What makes you think I'm protecting anything?" he asked. The question came softer than before. Less defensive, but more personal. She didn't hesitate. Because people who aren't protecting something don't work this hard to stay in control. The audience reacted, a quiet intake of breath, a shifting wave of tension moving through the seats like wind through leaves. And just like that, the conversation crossed another line. This wasn't about public image anymore. It wasn't about celebrity expectations. This was about something internal, something private. And it was happening right here live. He leaned back slightly in his chair. For a moment, his gaze broke away. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest he was thinking, not about what to say, but about whether to say anything at all. Because this was the point where most people retreat, where the walls go back up, where the smile returns, the tone lightens, and the moment disappears into something safer. But that's not what happened. Instead, he looked back at her. And when he spoke, there was something different in his voice. Not vulnerability in the way people often imagine it. Not emotional. Not exposed. But honest. In a way that felt unfamiliar. "Control," he said slowly, "isn't always about hiding something." The room stayed silent. "Sometimes," he continued, "it's about maintaining something. A beat. Something you've worked a long time to build." The audience listened. Really listened now. Not waiting for drama. Not expecting a clash. But absorbing something more complicated. She nodded slightly, acknowledging his point. But she didn't let go. "And what happens," she asked gently, "when maintaining that costs you something?" There it was. Not a challenge. A question. And somehow, that made it heavier. Because now there was no conflict to push against. No tension to deflect. Just truth waiting to be addressed. His fingers tapped lightly against the table. Once. Twice. A small, unconscious movement. But in a room this quiet, it echoed. "I think everything costs something," he said. "And you decide what you're willing to pay." The answer was strong. Grounded. But not final. Because she watched him carefully, as if she could sense there was more beneath it. "And do you ever wonder," she continued, "if the cost changes over time?" The question lingered. And this time, it hit differently. Because it wasn't about who he was now. It was about who he had been. And what it took to become that person. For a split second, something flickered again. Not hesitation. Not discomfort. Something closer to memory. He leaned forward slightly. Elbows resting on the table now. Closer. More present than he'd been at any point before. "I think," he said quietly, "that when you start out, you're willing to give everything." The audience leaned in even more. "You don't think about boundaries," he continued. "You don't think about what you're keeping for yourself." A pause. "You just give." His voice softened, not dramatically, but enough to shift the tone completely. "And then," he added, "you learn." Silence. Heavy. Understanding silence. The kind where no one moves because they don't want to break it. She didn't interrupt. Didn't push. Just listened. "And what do you learn?" she asked after a moment. The question came gently. Almost carefully. And for the first time, He didn't answer right away. His gaze dropped again. But this time it lingered, as if whatever he was about to say mattered. Not to the audience. Not to the show. To him. You learn, he said finally, that not everything you give is respected. A murmur moved through the audience. Soft. Sympathetic. Real. You learn that people take pieces of you, he continued, and turn them into something else. His eyes lifted again, steady now but carrying something deeper. Something that doesn't belong to you anymore. That line. It settled into the room like gravity. And suddenly everything made sense. The control. The distance. The careful answers. It wasn't just strategy. It was protection. Not of secrets, but of self. Across the table, her expression softened. Not in defeat. Not in retreat. In understanding. That's fair, she said quietly. And for the first time since this began, there was no edge in her voice at all. Just acknowledgement. But then, she asked one more question. Not sharp. Not confrontational. But powerful in its simplicity. So where does that leave you now? The room held its breath again. Because this was the question that didn't look backward. It looked forward. And sometimes, that's the harder one to answer. He sat there for a moment. Still, composed, but no longer distant. And when he spoke, it wasn't with the same certainty as before. I think, he began, then paused. Not for effect, but because he needed to. I think I'm still figuring that out. The honesty in that moment. It changed everything. The audience reacted instantly, not with shock, not with tension, but with something warmer. Applause. Real applause. Not for performance. For truth. Even the other hosts joined in, their expressions softer now. The tension that had filled the stage slowly dissolving into something else. Something quieter. Something human. But just as the moment seemed to settle, as the air finally began to ease, one of the producer's voices cut sharply through the earpieces backstage. Wrap in 30 seconds. The show was still live. Time hadn't stopped. And suddenly the reality of where they were rushed back in. The lights. The cameras. The millions watching. Across the table, she glanced briefly toward the crew, then back at him. And there was a look there now. Not challenge. Not curiosity. Respect. But also, something unresolved. Because even though the moment had shifted, even though something real had been shared, there was still a question hanging in the air. Unspoken. Unfinished. And as the segment edged closer to its end, everyone in that room could feel it. This story, this moment, it wasn't over. Not yet, because what happens next wouldn't stay on that stage. It would follow them, beyond the cameras, beyond the studio, into a world ready to react, and waiting to decide what it all meant. The applause didn't fade the way it usually does. It lingered, uneven, uncertain, almost reluctant to let go of what had just happened. Because everyone in that room knew. They hadn't just watched an interview. They had witnessed something real. The cameras pulled back slightly as one of the hosts stepped in, her voice warm, professional, gently guiding the moment toward its expected close. Well, that was a conversation, she said with a soft smile, earning a ripple of light laughter from the audience. Laughter that carried relief, but also disbelief. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, his expression composed again, but not in the same way as before. Something had shifted. Subtle but undeniable. Across the table, she met his gaze one last time. No tension now. No challenge. Just a quiet understanding. And something unspoken that neither of them tried to put into words. Thank you for being here, she said. And this time, it didn't sound like a routine line. Thank you, he replied. Simple, but grounded. The segment ended. The music rose. The audience clapped. And just like that, the show moved on. But the moment didn't. Not really, because what happens on live television doesn't stay contained anymore. It travels. Fast. The second the cameras cut, the room exhaled. You could hear it, the release of held breath, the soft shuffle of movement, the sudden return of noise as people began talking all at once. Did that just happen? Was that planned? No way that was scripted. Producers rushed in, their voices low but urgent, discussing timing, reactions, damage control, or maybe opportunity. One of them glanced toward him, as if trying to read his mood, but he had already stood up, adjusting his jacket with that same precise composure. Except now it felt different. Less like armor. More like habit. A co-host leaned over to her, whispering something quick. She smiled faintly, nodding, but her eyes drifted back toward him for just a second longer than necessary. Because even off camera, the moment hadn't fully let go. He exchanged a few words with the panel, polite, professional, nothing revealing. A handshake, a nod, a brief smile. But there was a quietness to him now. Not withdrawn, not uncomfortable, just reflective. And then he walked off stage. The lights dimmed slightly as the next segment prepared to begin, but the energy in the studio hadn't reset. It couldn't, because something had shifted, not just for those in the room, but for everyone watching beyond it. Within minutes, clips began to surface. Short snippets at first. A single line. A glance. A pause that lasted just a second too long. And then longer cuts. The full exchange. The tension. The silence. The honesty. It spread across screens like wildfire. Phones buzzed. Notifications stacked. Group chats lit up. Are you seeing this right now? I've never seen him like that. She really went there. And just like that, the conversation left the studio and entered the world. Some people saw confrontation. Others saw courage. Some said he had been pushed too far. Others said he had finally been seen. Debates formed instantly. On one side, voices defending his right to privacy, to control his narrative, to draw boundaries in a world that constantly demands more. On the other, voices arguing that visibility comes with responsibility, that connection requires openness, and that distance creates its own kind of story. Clips replayed again and again. That line, did you hear what he said? No, listen to her question again. That's what changed everything. Every pause analyzed, every expression interpreted, every word weighed, and somewhere in the middle of it all, the moment itself began to evolve. Because that's what happens when something real meets a world that's constantly watching. It becomes bigger, messier, more complicated. By the end of the day, it wasn't just a segment anymore. It was a headline, a discussion, a dividing line between perspectives. Some called it one of the most honest conversations ever seen on daytime television. Others called it uncomfortable, too personal, too far. But almost no one called it forgettable. Back at the studio, long after the audience had gone and the lights had dimmed completely, the echoes of that moment still seemed to linger. In empty seats, in quiet hallways, in conversations that continued behind closed doors. Because moments like that don't just disappear. They leave something behind. And somewhere else. Away from the cameras, away from the noise. He sat in silence, not surrounded by applause, not facing questions, just still, maybe replaying the moment, maybe letting it go, maybe understanding it in a way no one else could. Because while the world debated what it meant, for him it wasn't a headline. It was a moment, a real one, and those are the ones that stay with you. As the days passed, the intensity didn't fade, it shifted. From reaction to reflection. Articles turned into think pieces. Clips turned into discussions. People weren't just asking what happened anymore. They were asking why it mattered, why it felt different, why it stayed. And maybe the answer wasn't in the tension, or the confrontation, or even the honesty. Maybe it was in the fact that, for just a few minutes, the distance between celebrity and reality disappeared, and everyone watching got to see what was underneath. Not everything, but enough. Enough to feel it. Enough to remember it. Enough to keep talking about it long after the cameras stopped rolling. And now here you are, watching this unfold, thinking about what it meant. So tell me, what do you think really happened in that moment? Was it a clash? A breakthrough? Or something in between? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories that pull you into moments like this, raw, intense, and impossible to ignore, make sure you subscribe to Stage View, hit that like button, and stay with us. Because the next story might be even bigger.